I arrived earlier than planned. I'd told Emily I'd probably miss the beginning of the reception. I had a late client meeting up the coast, and I didn't want to rush through traffic. But the meeting got canceled last minute, so I figured I'd surprise her. Maybe get in a few dances, show my face for the firm. It was a charity event, something Emily helped organize every year at this beautiful private coastal hotel. The kind of place with monogram napkins and soft jazz that plays louder than people talk. I parked in the circular driveway, tossed the valet my keys, and walked in expecting to see my wife playing host, maybe coordinating the silent auction or sipping white wine by the bar. Instead, I stepped into the ballroom and saw something else entirely. Emily, on the dance floor, with Michael. They weren't dancing like acquaintances or even like two colleagues blowing off steam after a stressful week. No, they were close, too close. His hand was resting just a bit too comfortably on the small of her back, and their fingers were interlaced like they'd been dancing this way for years. Their faces were tilted in toward each other, foreheads nearly touching, like whatever they were whispering back and forth was more important than the music, the event, or, apparently, the fact that she had a husband who had just walked in the room. I didn't move. For a few seconds, I stood there in the entrance, halfway between stunned and frozen, trying to process what I was seeing. At first, I questioned myself. Maybe I was misreading it. Maybe it was the lighting, or maybe they were just caught in a weird angle. But then, Michael turned slightly, laughing at something Emily said, and I saw them. The cufflinks. My cufflinks. Silver, engraved with the coordinates of the hiking trail where I proposed to her. The exact ones I had given Emily for our 5th wedding anniversary, neatly tucked inside a navy velvet box. She had cried when I gave them to her, called them perfect. Then about a year later, she claimed she lost them during a spa weekend in Napa with her friends. She was devastated, or so she said. Searched for them for days, tore apart our luggage when we got home. I ended up consoling her, telling her they were just a thing, that it didn't matter. But there they were, glinting under the ballroom lights, fastened neatly on his sleeves. Same brushed silver, same tiny initials etched in the corner. I'd recognize them anywhere. I didn't even realize I'd been holding my breath until Emily finally turned her head and saw me. She froze. Not dramatically, not in a gasp and cover her mouth way. Just for a second, but enough for me to see it. The microsecond of panic behind her eyes before she pasted on a smile and untangled her hand from Michael's. She muttered something to him, then practically floated off the dance floor and toward me like nothing happened. "Jason," she said brightly, reaching out for my hand. "You're early." I nodded. "Yeah, thought I'd surprise you." She leaned in to kiss me on the cheek, not the lips, and squeezed my hand. "That's sweet. I wasn't expecting you until later." I tilted my head slightly, eyes flicking behind her. "You looked busy." She glanced back at the dance floor as if she didn't know what I was referring to. "Oh, that was just Michael being Michael. He's been helping with the event all week. It was a silly dance, nothing serious." "Haven't seen those cufflinks in a while," I said, trying to keep my voice even. Her eyes snapped back to mine. I caught the hesitation before she covered it with a casual shrug. "He said he found them at the office," she said quickly. "In a donation box, of all places. Isn't that weird?" "Donation box?" I repeated. "That's convenient." She smiled again, a little tighter this time. "Jason, don't start. It's a charity event. People are mingling, dancing. I didn't expect you to walk in and get all Sherlock Holmes on me." "I'm not starting anything," I said. "Just wasn't expecting to see my wife slow dancing with someone she said she barely talks to at work. Wearing something I gave you." She lowered her voice and stepped closer, trying to make it an asterisk mate. Like we were whispering sweet nothings instead of navigating the edge of something dangerous. "You've been working late almost every night for the past 2 months," she said softly, almost like a warning. "Sometimes, I barely see you. You come home exhausted, half listening, buried in your phone. I've been doing all of this by myself, the planning, the logistics, everything. I needed someone to help me, and Michael offered. He's just a friend, Jason." I raised an eyebrow. "A friend with your cufflinks?" Her tone hardened just enough to let me know she was drawing a line. Are you really doing this here? At a charity event I spent weeks planning? I didn't answer. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I knew what this was. I've been in sales long enough to know when someone is shifting the narrative. The guilt flip, the redirection. This wasn't about the dance or the cufflinks or even Michael. She was making it about me, about how much I worked, about how absent I'd been, about how I hadn't noticed the things that were changing. Suddenly, I was the reason her hands were wrapped around another man on a ballroom dance floor. I let out a breath and nodded, swallowing the dozen questions rising in my throat. Fine, I said. We'll talk about it later. She smiled, relieved. Thank you. But her hand didn't return to mine, and when she walked back toward the table with the auction items, she didn't glance back once. I stood there for a moment longer, letting the music wash over me. The band had shifted into something more upbeat now, violins and saxophone, blending together in a way that felt deliberately oblivious. Around me, the room was full of laughter and wine glasses clinking, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. I didn't cause a scene. I didn't confront Michael. I didn't ask about the late nights or the new dresses in her closet. I didn't ask why her phone had been face down on the counter every night for the last month, or why the passcode changed last week. But I started paying attention, because in that moment, standing there in a ballroom full of polished strangers and champagne smiles, I knew. I didn't just suspect something was off. I knew, and Emily knew I knew too. She just wasn't ready to admit it yet. That night, after the reception, I lay in bed wide awake. Emily was asleep beside me, or at least pretending to be. Her back was turned, her breathing even, like she was deliberately performing sleep so I wouldn't talk. I stared at the ceiling, replaying the dance, the cufflinks, the deflection. It didn't feel like something I could brush off anymore. And now that the first crack had shown itself, it was like everything else I had ignored started rushing back in a wave I couldn't shut off. Little things. At first, it was the business trips. She said she was visiting clients in San Diego or San Jose, always with last-minute notices, always booked on a whim. She'd leave on a Friday morning and come back late Saturday night, too tired to talk. I remember asking her once why I couldn't come along, even just to make a weekend out of it. She laughed and said, "You? In a room full of marketing execs talking about brand positioning for 8 hours? You'd be bored out of your mind." I believed her. I trusted her. Then there was her phone. It used to be just another object in the house, sitting face up on the counter, chirping with group texts and calendar pings. But lately it was always face down, and quiet. No sounds, no notifications. Just still. She changed the passcode last month. Said it was because of an app update or something dumb like that. I didn't think much of it at the time. But lying there in the dark, with her back turned to me, all of those not a big deal moments started to pile up. They weren't isolated anymore. They were a pattern. And the scent. God. How did I not see it sooner? It started maybe 2 months ago. Friday nights, she'd come home from girls' night, with a new scent clinging to her coat. Not perfume, not hers, anyway. Something heavier, masculine. Once, I asked if someone hugged her wearing cologne. She laughed and said, "Some guy brushed past me at the bar. You know how packed it gets." It sounded plausible. Everything did until it didn't. Even her style had changed. Slowly, like watching the tide creep in. She used to wear conservative stuff, neat blouses, soft tones, flats. Now it was bold dresses, tight cuts, heels she used to call ridiculous when other women wore them. I complimented her once, and she said she just felt like switching things up. I smiled, kissed her cheek, and didn't think to question it. But now I couldn't stop questioning everything. I turned to look at her sleeping form, the rise and fall of her back, the soft rustle of the sheets. This woman whose habits I used to know like my own. This woman who used to reach for my hand in her sleep, who used to call me every afternoon just to say hi. Now she slept with oceans between us. I thought back to the night a month ago when she came home late. One of those team outings. She smelled like whiskey and leather seats. She dropped her keys twice trying to get through the door. Her lipstick was smeared, and she looked surprised to see me awake. "You scared me," she'd said, laughing too loud. "Why are you up?" "I couldn't sleep," I told her. "Did you have fun?" She hesitated just for a second. "Yeah, just drinks. I didn't even stay that long." I asked who was there. She named people from her team. All women. Funny, because the next day, when I casually asked if Michelle was the one who drove her home, she blinked like she didn't remember the story she'd told. "Oh, no, I actually took a lift," she said. "I meant we all left at the same time." Something didn't sit right then. It had gnawed at me quietly, but I let it go. Now I couldn't. I sat up, swung my legs over the edge of the bed, and just breathed for a while. My mind was racing too fast to settle. Every smile that felt slightly too practiced, every moment she turned her phone away from me, every work dinner she left dressed like she was going clubbing. It all began to take shape, like a puzzle I hadn't even realized I'd been assembling for months. I walked down the hallway, sat on the couch in the living room, and turned on the TV just to have noise. I kept it low, not really watching. I just needed something to drown out the sound of my own thoughts. It wasn't just the recent stuff, either. I started going back further. 3, maybe 4 months ago, she started coming to bed after me almost every night. She'd say she was catching up on emails or watching something on her iPad, but I remember one night getting up for water around 2 a.m. and seeing her sitting on the couch, smiling down at her phone. She didn't hear me. I stood in the kitchen for a full minute watching her type, delete, type again. She looked flustered, like a teenager texting her crush. When I walked in, she jumped. "Hey," I said. "Couldn't sleep?" She minimized the screen so fast I barely caught a glimpse of it. "Just checking email," she said quickly. "What are you doing up?" "Water." She nodded too fast and said she'd come to bed soon. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was memory turned into evidence. That night at the reception, the dance, the cufflinks. It wasn't the beginning of anything. It was just the first time I let myself see what had already been happening right in front of me. What did I really know about Michael? Not much. He worked in the creative department. Met him once at a mixer. He was tall, smug in a quiet way, the kind of guy who always has a glass of something expensive in his hand and a story ready for the right audience. I remember Emily introducing us. She was glowing that night, new dress, heels, her hair done in waves. When she said, "Jason, this is Michael." It was the way she said his name that made my stomach tighten a little. I shook it off, thought I was being paranoid. Now I wondered if that night had been the beginning, or if it started even earlier. I got up and walked to the bookshelf, where we kept old photo albums, framed memories of anniversaries and vacations. I picked up a frame from a trip to Tahoe 2 winters ago. Emily was wearing a red scarf, leaning into me, our cheeks pressed together, snow in the background. She looked happy, but now I wondered how much of it was real. I'd always thought cheating was something that happened to other people, that it came with shouting, slammed doors, and lipstick on the collar. But now I knew better. Sometimes it was subtle, 1,000 tiny choices, a text left unanswered, password changed, a quiet shift in scent. Sometimes it was dancing in a public ballroom, wearing someone else's story on your wrist, while your husband walked in the front door, and then blaming him for noticing. A week later, I followed her. I'd never done anything like that before, not in any relationship. I've always believed in trust, in privacy, in giving the person you love the benefit of the doubt. But that morning, when she left the house in a blue dress I'd never seen before, said she had an afternoon gallery viewing with colleagues, and smiled a little too brightly, I knew something was off. That dress wasn't professional. It was deliberately chosen. She looked beautiful, no question. Hair done, heels on, perfume I hadn't smelled in months. She barely looked at me as she left. Just a quick peck on the cheek and a rushed "don't wait up." I waited exactly 5 minutes after she left before grabbing my keys and heading out. She hadn't noticed that I'd parked her old location pinned back on her phone a few nights ago, using the family account's Find My Device feature. She thought she'd disabled it. She hadn't. I watched her little blue dot drift east, away from the gallery district, past downtown, and finally come to a stop near the city's historic quarter. Not exactly a hotspot for team-building outings. I drove in silence, a storm brewing behind my ribs. I didn't know what I was going to do when I got there. I only knew I had to see it for myself. I wasn't chasing a rumor. I wasn't going off a hunch. I needed undeniable, visual, stand-in-front-of-me truth. Because part of me still wanted to be wrong. When I arrived, I parked half a block away and walked up the narrow sidewalk slowly. The buildings in this part of town were old. Weathered brick, wine bars tucked between antique shops and overpriced boutiques. And that's when I saw her, Emily. She was standing across the street under the awning of a little wine bar with ivy climbing up its columns. She checked her phone, then looked up and smiled. Michael stepped out from a side door. Not a handshake, not a friendly wave. She walked straight into his arms. It wasn't the hug of two friends who hadn't seen each other in a while. It was familiar, mate. The kind of hug that lingers a second longer than it should. Her hands slid along his back, her fingers tracing the exact spot where his cufflinks caught the light. I watched her laugh. That same breathy, flirty laugh she used to reserve for me, and then they disappeared inside. I stayed across the street, pressed against the wall of a bookstore, heart pounding. I told myself I'd wait 5 minutes, then leave. I told myself I didn't need to see more, but I stood there for over 2 hours. The bar's big windows were dimmed by design, but I could still make out the outline of their silhouettes through the glass. At one point, I saw her reach across the table and touch his wrist. She laughed again. He leaned in close, whispered something in her ear, and she nodded slowly. And just like that, whatever doubt I had left inside me shattered. They finally came out just after sunset. Michael was holding the door for her. She stepped into the golden hour light like nothing was wrong in the world. Her hair was messier now, like someone had run their fingers through it. Her lipstick looked a little faded. They stood close on the sidewalk, talking, smiling. She touched his arm again. Then, without a goodbye kiss, without anything overt, they turned and walked in opposite directions. Calculated. Practiced. I waited until she disappeared around the corner before I moved. I didn't go after her. I didn't call her. I didn't even get in my car right away. I just stood there on that street, watching the wine bar door close behind them, feeling like the ground beneath me had changed shape, like I'd slipped into someone else's life. There it was. The proof I'd been too afraid to find. Not words. Not speculation. Not intuition. This wasn't a conversation I'd misinterpreted or a phone left face down. This was my wife, lying to my face and walking into another man's arms. All the small things added up in an instant. The cufflinks, the secrecy, the Friday nights, the perfume, the sudden interest in dresses that didn't belong in a conference room. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't me being distant or overworked. It was her. She had crossed a line, and she'd done it more than once. I sat in my car for a long time. The wheel under my hands felt foreign, like I didn't remember how to drive. I kept thinking of how calm she was when she lied to me, how easily the story had slipped from her mouth. Gallery with colleagues. I wondered how many times she'd rehearsed it. If she texted Michael to say, he bought it. I wondered how often I'd made dinner while she was out with him. How many times I'd kissed her goodnight after she came home from being in his arms. Back at home, she arrived hours later than she'd said she would. She came through the door with that same energy she always had, breezy, distracted, like she was just tired from a long day. She kicked off her shoes, hung her purse, and greeted me with a quick, casual, "Hey babe, sorry I'm late." The gallery ran long. There was some last-minute auction prep. I looked up from the couch and nodded. Cool. She didn't ask what I'd done that day. She didn't notice anything was different. I studied her face as she talked about some painting she fell in love with. How she thought maybe she'd go back and buy a print. She talked like someone who still believed they were fooling you. And I listened like someone who'd finally stopped pretending. That night, I lay next to her in bed again, same as I had the night of the reception. She fell asleep quickly. Or pretended to. She was facing the other way again. But this time I didn't stare at the ceiling. I stared at her. And I didn't feel confusion anymore. I felt clarity. And something colder. Resolve. I couldn't stop thinking about the cufflinks. It was a weird thing to fixate on. I know out of everything I'd seen, everything I'd now confirmed, the most innocuous detail should have been the least important. But for some reason, I kept circling back to them. Those silver cufflinks. The ones I gave Emily for our 5th anniversary. Engraved. Personal. Meaningful. She had cried when I handed her the box. Told me it was the most thoughtful thing anyone's ever done. And then, less than a year later, she said they were gone. Lost in a hotel room drawer, she claimed. Maybe the spa locker room. We called the front desk. I remember her voice on the phone. Frantic, desperate. They were a gift from my husband, she told them. Her voice catching just enough to make me believe every word. And now they were on Michael's wrists. I kept picturing her hand on his arm at the wine bar, her fingers grazing the metal. Like she knew what they were. Like she had given them to him. That's when it hit me. What if they were never lost? What if she never wore them for me at all? That thought led me down a path I wasn't ready for, the past. Not just the recent past, the months of suspicion and lies, but before that. Before me. I started wondering how far back Michael went in her life. Because there was a familiarity between them I couldn't unsee now. Not the kind you develop over a few happy hours at work or committee meetings. No, it felt older. Practiced. Like they had history. So I did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled out our old university yearbooks. Emily and I met after college. She worked in marketing. I was a financial analyst trying to build my portfolio. We bumped into each other at a friend's engagement party. I didn't know her during her college years. She'd tell stories here and there. Funny dorm stuff, roommates, late-night cramming, but nothing too deep. I remembered vaguely that she once mentioned being part of a marketing competition back in school. Something regional. She said her team won, that it helped her land her first internship. At the time, I was proud of her. Now, I was suspicious. I dug through the storage bins in the guest room closet until I found a box labeled Emily College Stuff. It had her old planner, some notebooks, and a few keepsakes I'd never really paid attention to before. Tucked inside a binder was a flyer. A printed page titled Western Marketing Challenge, First Place Winners. The year matched the timeline. And there, under the headline, was a photo. Emily, smiling wide, holding a glass plaque. Next to her, just slightly angled toward her, was Michael. I stared at the photo for a long time. Same build, same smile, same casually confident expression like he knew exactly what he was doing. His hand was resting lightly on her shoulder, and she wasn't pulling away. If anything, she looked proud. The way her body tilted toward his said everything I didn't want to read. I flipped the page over. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "To M. We crushed it. So proud of us. E. M. Michael." So he had been in her life before me. Not just a coworker or a new friend from the office. He'd been there at the start, during one of the most formative years of her life. A shared victory. A shared something. But here's what chilled me. In the photo, she was wearing earrings. Not just any earrings. They were small, silver, rectangular, shaped like cufflinks. I pulled up a picture of the original cufflinks on my phone, one I'd taken years ago for a custom engraving order. The resemblance was undeniable. She hadn't lost the cufflinks. She'd converted them, transformed them into earrings, which meant they had been important enough to keep, but not in the way I thought. Not as a memento from me, but as a token from him. Something old, something meaningful, something she had hidden in plain sight for years. It was like a punch to the chest. What else had I missed? How many of our shared moments had been shadows of a story I wasn't even part of? How many inside jokes, subtle references, or unexplained smiles had been pieces of a private timeline that existed before I ever walked into her life? I put the photo back in the box, then sat on the edge of the guest bed, clutching the sides like the floor might fall out from under me. The walls of our marriage, our story, felt suddenly paper-thin, like if I pushed too hard, they'd cave in and reveal something older underneath. A version of Emily I'd never met. One I wasn't supposed to see. The cufflinks weren't just evidence of an affair. They were a symbol, a bridge between then and now, a thread she never cut. And I was starting to understand that I had walked into a story already in progress, thinking I was chapter 1 when really I was somewhere in the middle, a supporting role in a plot written years before I ever said hello. When Emily got home that evening, I watched her carefully. She was in her casual clothes now, jeans, loose sweater, no makeup. She smiled like nothing had happened, like she hadn't spent the weekend lying to me. I asked her how the gallery was. She gave me a quick rundown of great pieces, networking, and how exhausted she felt. I nodded, pretending to listen, but my mind was still on that photo, still on the cufflinks turned earrings turned cufflinks again. I didn't ask about Michael. Not yet. I wanted to see how long she could lie to me, how many versions of herself she'd invent to keep the curtain from falling. And more importantly, I needed to decide what I was going to do with the truth I now carried. Because this wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about history, and I was finally starting to realize just how far back it went. I wasn't going to scream. That was the decision I made when I started planning the confrontation. No yelling, no accusations thrown across a kitchen table. I didn't want to give her the chance to cry or twist the narrative. This wasn't going to be about emotion. It was going to be about facts. The truth didn't need drama. It needed silence. So I invited her to dinner. Our spot. The place by the bay we used to go for special occasions. Anniversaries, birthdays, or just when life felt heavy and we wanted to remember how light it used to be. The view was always the same. Glass windows overlooking the water, lights from the docks shimmering in the tide, the low hum of boat masts clinking in the wind. Nostalgia worked in my favor. I wanted her off balance. She said yes too quickly. Just us? She asked. Yeah, just us. She smiled, and I wondered if she thought I was trying to fix things, that this was my peace offering, that maybe I'd stopped asking questions. The lies had gotten too easy for her. But what she didn't know was that I'd already called the restaurant in advance and added one more name to the reservation. Michael. When we arrived, she was wearing a black dress I'd seen once before, 2 years ago at a New Year's Eve party. Back when we still held hands in public without thinking about it. I remembered her in that dress. But now, sitting across from her in the candlelight, I couldn't help but feel like I was dining with someone wearing my wife's face. Thanks for this, she said, sipping her wine. It's nice. We've needed this. I nodded. Yeah, we really have. We made small talk, the menu, the wine, how work had been stressful. She talked like everything was fine. I watched her movements, her tone, the way she avoided eye contact just long enough when I mentioned weekends. I barely heard her. My thoughts were counting down. At exactly 7:42 p.m. The host approached our table. Mr. Carter, he said, glancing briefly at me, then turning to Emily. Your guest has arrived. She blinked. Guest. And then she saw him. Michael walked toward us with that same practiced calm he probably used in meetings. Confident, polite, but just a little smug. He was wearing the cufflinks again. The same ones from that night. My cufflinks. He smiled at Emily. Her expression froze mid-sip. Hope I'm not too late, he said, sliding into the third seat I'd reserved. Emily's glass hit the table with a soft clink. Jason, she said slowly. What is this? I leaned back in my chair, folding my napkin calmly. I thought we should all talk. Michael's eyes flicked toward her. I didn't know you invited me too, he said to her. Pretending. Of course he was pretending. This wasn't his first time lying to someone's face. She turned to him. You shouldn't be here. No, I said. He should. You both should. The silence at the table was sharp. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the folded university photo. The one of the two of them smiling with their trophy. I laid it flat on the table, the candlelight flickering across the faces of a younger Emily and Michael. Remember this? I asked her. Emily's lips parted, but no words came out. I pointed at the earrings. You turned them into cufflinks. Or maybe you just gave them back to him. Michael looked uncomfortable now. Like the walls he kept so carefully constructed had started to shift. He glanced at the photo, then down at his cufflinks, adjusting them like he just realized they were glowing. I don't know what you're trying to prove, Emily said finally. Don't you? I asked. You said you barely knew him, that he was just a colleague. But this? I tapped the photo. This isn't nothing. This is a history. Michael spoke up. Jason, I think maybe this should be a private conversation. No, I said, looking directly at him. You've been involved in my life for months without invitation. You're going to hear this. Emily looked away. Her hands were clenched in her lap now. Her mask was slipping, but she still tried to keep the air of control. So what, Jason? You stalked me? You went digging through my old things just to corner me here? I didn't have to dig very far. You left a trail, I said. You wore it, on your wrist, at a wine bar, while you were supposed to be somewhere else. Her jaw tightened. It wasn't what you think. I nodded. Right? You weren't at a gallery. You weren't with colleagues. And you didn't come home late because of traffic. Michael exhaled like he was about to speak again, but I cut him off. I followed her. I saw you both. The wine bar, the touch, the timing. You weren't hiding. You just didn't think I'd ever look. Emily finally spoke again, her voice sharp now. You're making a scene. I looked around the room. No one was watching. No one cared. We were in a corner, tucked away from the rest of the dining room. Quiet, controlled, exactly how I wanted it. I'm not making a scene, I said. I'm making a decision. Emily's voice dropped. What decision? That I'm done pretending I'm the only one trying here, I said. I'm done asking questions when the answers are written all over your face. She looked like she wanted to say something, but all that came out was a shallow breath. For the first time, I saw something real, not guilt, not panic. Just fatigue, like she'd run out of lies, and even she didn't believe them anymore. Michael pushed his chair back. Maybe I should leave. You should have done that months ago, I said, not looking at him. He didn't respond, just stood up, adjusted his jacket, and walked away. Emily stared down at her plate. Her hands were shaking now. I reached into my coat again and pulled out the final piece, the printout of her gallery invite. It was blank, just a fabricated event placeholder she'd added to her calendar. No venue, no address, no attendees. I laid it beside the photo. I don't need an apology, I said. And I don't want a story. I just want the truth to sit here on the table, like everything else. She looked at it for a long time. Finally, she whispered, It didn't start the way you think. It started before me, I said. She didn't deny it. I stood up, leaving money for the meal I hadn't touched. I'll see you at home. She nodded once, still staring down at the remnants of a story I hadn't written, but had been forced to live in. And I walked away,